It was 23:47 hours, November 13th, 1942. The waters of the Solomon Islands were pitch black, the moon hidden behind thick, low clouds. The air was heavy, almost suffocating. Out on the dark surface of Iron Bottom Sound, waves slapped quietly against steel hulls, and somewhere far in the distance, the last echoes of daytime gunfire still lingered like a ghost. On the Japanese battleship Hai, the bridge crew studied their maps under dim red light. The ship's captain, Nishida Masao, leaned over the plotting table. His brow was furrowed. American fleet sighted earlier, then vanished. "This is troubling," he muttered. All around him, the men had the same uneasy thought. Where were the Americans? They believed they had control of these waters. For months, Japanese naval forces had dominated the night battles here. Their long-range Type 93 Long Lance torpedoes were unmatched, and their night fighting doctrine was the pride of the Imperial Navy. Every sailor here had been told, at night, Japan was invincible. They were wrong, because somewhere in the black waters, closing the distance with silent precision, were two of America's most dangerous battleships, the USS Washington and USS South Dakota, along with a screen of 4 destroyers. And they weren't alone by accident. This was no desperate patrol. This was Admiral William Bull Halsey's trap. 4 days earlier, November 9th, 1942, American intelligence at Pearl Harbor intercepted Japanese radio traffic. Codebreakers in the basement of Station HYPO confirmed it. Japan was sending a massive reinforcement force to Guadalcanal. Nearly 11,000 troops, dozens of artillery pieces, fuel, ammunition, and, most dangerously, battleships to bombard Henderson Field. If Henderson Field fell, Guadalcanal would be lost, and with it, America's ability to push back in the South Pacific. Halsey had no choice. He summoned Rear Admiral Willis Lee, commander of Battleship Division 6, and laid it out. "Willis, you're going in at night. You'll find them, and you'll sink them." Lee knew what that meant. Japan's night fighting skills were legendary. No American battleship had ever engaged in a major radar-directed night battle before. One wrong move, and his ships could be reduced to burning hulks before they even saw the enemy. But Lee also had something the Japanese didn't: SG radar. Unlike Japan's optical rangefinders, this radar could see through darkness, smoke, and rain. And in the coming fight, it would turn the tables completely. Back in Iron Bottom Sound, 23:50 hours. American destroyers USS Walk, Benham, Preston, and Gwynn moved ahead of the battleships like silent wolves. Each destroyer carried torpedoes primed for a first strike. On the USS Washington, radar operators reported multiple contacts, 14 ships, bearing 210 range, 18,000 yards, and closing. Lee studied the glowing green blips on the screen. They were outnumbered, badly. The Japanese had battleships Hai and Kirishima, cruisers Nagara and Sendai, plus at least a dozen destroyers. But Lee's voice was calm. "We'll take the big ones first. Battleships on the battleships, destroyers, you have your orders." At 0:02, the Walk launched her torpedoes. Moments later, the sea erupted. A massive explosion lit up the night as one Japanese destroyer disintegrated, scattering debris across the water. The Japanese formation instantly broke into chaos. Searchlights flashed on, slicing through the blackness. The USS South Dakota opened fire first. Her 16-inch/45 caliber Mark 6 guns hurled 1-ton shells across the darkness at nearly 2,300 feet per second. The shockwave from each blast rattled windows as far away as Guadalcanal's coast. On the Hai, shells tore into her superstructure, knocking out communications and killing key officers on the bridge. But Japan hit back. Torpedoes streaked toward the American destroyers. The Preston took a direct hit and exploded, her magazine detonating in a blinding flash. Walk followed moments later, sinking in under a minute. Lee didn't flinch. Washington's radar still tracked Kirishima perfectly. At a range of 8,400 yards, Lee gave the order: "Fire for effect." 9 16-inch shells slammed into Kirishima in under 3 minutes. 2 penetrated her armor belt. 1 struck her rudder, locking it in place. She began to list, her crew desperately trying to fight flooding while still firing back. By 0:40, the battle was turning. Radar-directed gunfire had given the Americans a decisive edge. Japan's famous night vision optics were useless against an enemy they could barely see. Captain Nishida of the High finally understood. They are seeing us in the dark, like it is day. And then he knew. The Imperial Navy had no defense against this new weapon. American radar had shattered the myth of Japanese night supremacy. This was only the beginning. The next hour would see one of the most brutal night battles in Pacific history. A fight that would leave the waters of Iron Bottom Sound littered with steel, oil, and the bodies of men who had believed they could not lose. 042 hours, November 13th, 1942. The smell of burning oil drifted over Iron Bottom Sound, mixing with the sharp tang of cordite from the big guns. The Japanese formation was no longer a tight arrow slicing through the sea. It was a scattering of wounded beasts, some trying to regroup, others simply trying to survive. On the USS Washington, Admiral Willis Lee stood in the dimly lit Combat Information Center, eyes fixed on the glowing radar scope. Every sweep of the beam showed the same truth. The enemy was still there, but they were faltering. Target 2 is slowing. Target 3 is veering off course, the radar operator reported. Lee's mind worked quickly. He knew the Japanese would try to withdraw before daylight, but until then, they were fair game. The Japanese battleship Kirishima, a 31,000-ton Congo-class veteran of the Great War, was bleeding badly. In the last 20 minutes, she had taken at least 9 direct hits from Washington's 16-inch guns. Her rudder was jammed at a 10-degree angle, forcing her into an awkward circle that made her an easy target. On her deck, chaos reigned. Fires raged near the aft turrets. Sailors screamed orders over the roar of damage control pumps, and the chief engineer reported that flooding in the aft boiler room was uncontrollable. Captain Iwabuchi Sanji knew they had to either beach the ship on Guadalcanal's coast or abandon her before daylight exposed her to air attack. Meanwhile, the South Dakota, temporarily blinded by electrical failures from earlier shell hits, was under heavy fire from Japanese cruisers Nagara and Sendai, plus at least 4 destroyers. Searchlights from the Japanese ships stabbed through the night, illuminating her massive silhouette. Shells slammed into her superstructure, destroying one of her radar arrays and killing men on the bridge. But her armor held, and she refused to die. Lee knew the destroyers had paid dearly in the opening exchange. Walk and Preston were gone. Benham was crippled with her bow blown open by a torpedo, and Gwyn was damaged, but they had done their job. They had drawn Japanese fire and created enough confusion for the battleships to move into killing position. All batteries, shift to target 1, range 7,500 yards, fire at will. Lee barked. The Washington's main guns belched fire again, each blast shaking the ship to her keel. At this range, her armor-piercing shell struck with over 2,000 pounds of steel and explosive force. They punched through Kirishima's armor like paper, detonating deep inside. One shell tore through the engine room, killing everyone inside instantly. Another smashed into the forward turret, jamming its massive guns. Below decks, Japanese sailors struggled in the dark, waist-deep in rising seawater, desperately trying to pump it out. But with the ship locked in a slow turn, she was taking on water faster than the pumps could manage. At 0:55, the Kirishima's forward ammunition magazine was threatened by spreading fires. Damage control teams fought with hoses and sand, but every time they made progress, another shell came crashing in. The captain ordered counter-flooding to stabilize the list, but it only slowed the inevitable. On the High, things were no better. The ship had already been mauled the night before in the first naval battle of Guadalcanal, and now, limping away from the scene, she was under constant harassment from American PT boats and, by dawn, would face the wrath of Henderson Field's bombers. Her days were numbered. In Tokyo, naval doctrine still clung to the belief that the Mark I human eyeball, trained in night optics, could outperform any machine. But in Iron Bottom Sound, reality was rewriting the rulebook. On Washington, the SG radar was tracking targets with precision down to the yard. Even when South Dakota disappeared from Japanese visual contact due to smoke, the Americans knew exactly where she was and where the enemy ships were. This was the first major proof that radar-directed fire control could dominate a night battle at sea. Japanese sailors, used to holding the advantage after sunset, found themselves utterly blind. Their searchlights, once a weapon of intimidation, now only made them beacons for American gunners. By 1:05, Hiroshima was barely maneuvering, listing more than 10 degrees to starboard. Lee, ever the cautious commander, didn't waste shells once he saw she was finished. He shifted fire to the retreating cruisers, scoring hits on Nagara and forcing her to disengage. Japanese destroyers attempted a last torpedo attack to cover the withdrawal. In the confusion, they fired wildly, and most of the deadly Type 93 Long Lance torpedoes sped harmlessly into the darkness. One passed under Washington without detonating, a miracle that could have changed the entire battle. At 3:25, Hiroshima's crew began abandoning ship. She rolled over and sank just before 4 o'clock, taking over 300 men with her. When dawn broke over the Solomon Islands, the American survivors could see the cost of the fight. 2 destroyers lay on the seabed, hundreds of sailors were gone, and South Dakota limped away for repairs. But they had done the impossible. They had destroyed one of Japan's prized battleships in a night fight and lived to tell the tale. In total, Japan lost the Hiroshima, 2 destroyers, and suffered heavy damage to others. More importantly, the psychological blow was immense. For the first time in the Pacific War, Japanese sailors realized they could not trust the cover of night. America had a weapon that nullified their greatest strength. From this battle onward, the Imperial Navy was forced to rethink its night tactics, but it was too late. The tide was turning in the Pacific. And here's the haunting truth. The battle didn't just save Guadalcanal. It marked the beginning of the end for Japan's dominance at sea. The night, once their ally, had turned against them. Dawn, November 13, 1942. The first light of day broke over the Solomon Islands like a reluctant confession. Smoke hung low over Iron Bottom Sound, and the sea was littered with wreckage, planks, lifeboats, shattered masts, and the occasional orange life jacket drifting alone in the current. The Hiroshima was gone, resting in her grave 3,500 meters below, and with her, Japan had lost not just a warship, but something far more dangerous to lose, the illusion of night supremacy. Admiral Willis Lee stood on the USS Washington's bridge, scanning the horizon through salt-streaked binoculars. His ship had fired 75 main battery shells in less than an hour, each one a steel giant hurled into the darkness with radar precision, and she still had enough ammunition for another fight. But Lee wasn't smiling. He knew the battle was far from over. By 7 o'clock, Japanese reconnaissance planes from Bougainville had located the American ships. Admiral Nobuyuta Kondo, commanding the remnants of the Japanese task force from the cruiser Otago, ordered an immediate retaliatory airstrike. His plan was desperate: throw every available bomber at the Americans before they could retreat beyond range. Meanwhile, at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, the U.S. Cactus Air Force was already airborne. Pilots who had barely slept scrambled into their cockpits, roaring down the battered airstrip to intercept the incoming wave. The morning sky became a chessboard of death. Aichi D-3A Val dive bombers came in high, while Nakajima B-5 and Kate torpedo bombers skimmed the waves. American Grumman F-4F Wildcats clawed for altitude, while anti-aircraft guns thundered from every available ship. Tracers streaked upward, tearing through wings and fuselages. The Japanese managed to land one bomb near South Dakota, worsening her damage, but the airstrike failed to sink any American ships. Far below the surface, another threat was moving into position. Japanese submarine I-26 had been shadowing the American fleet through the night. At 9:15, her captain spotted the crippled Benham, still limping with her bow nearly torn off from the earlier torpedo hit. The submarine closed the distance, but before it could fire, Benham's captain made the heartbreaking decision to scuttle his own ship. Her crew was taken aboard Gwyn, and Benham slipped beneath the waves, another casualty in a battle that had already claimed too many. The I-26 never got her shot, but the message was clear: the Americans couldn't linger here forever. Even as Kondo retreated north, the battered battleship High was still afloat, barely. She had been mauled the night before in the first naval battle of Guadalcanal, and now she was listing badly, her steering gone. American planes from Henderson Field pounced again and again, dropping 1,000-pound bombs and launching Mark 13 torpedoes. Fires raged across her deck, and by 1900 hours that evening, she was abandoned. Minutes later, she capsized and sank. For Japan, losing Hai and Kirishima within 24 hours was a naval earthquake. It was the first time in history that two battleships had been lost in consecutive nights of combat. The Japanese had entered the Solomons campaign confident in their Type 93 Long Lance torpedoes, their superior optics, and the aggressive night-fighting doctrine developed before the war. At Savo Island in August 1942, they had used these advantages to devastating effect, sinking 4 Allied cruisers in a single night without losing a ship. But November 1942 shattered that confidence. The SG radar on Washington could detect targets over 20,000 yards away, in complete darkness, in rain, or even behind smoke screens. The American gunners didn't need to see their targets. The radar saw for them, and the fire control computers did the rest. In contrast, Japanese lookouts had to expose themselves to the night wind, scanning through binoculars for silhouettes, muzzle flashes, or the faint glint of moonlight on a bow wave. The moment they switched on a searchlight to identify a target, they became a glowing bullseye. From this night onward, the Imperial Navy knew that radar had turned the darkness into American territory. By the end of November 15th, the numbers told a grim story. American losses: 2 battleships damaged, South Dakota, Washington, 3 destroyers sunk, Walk, Preston, Benham, over 240 sailors killed. Japanese losses: 2 battleships sunk, Kirishima, Hai, 3 destroyers sunk, 1 cruiser heavily damaged, over 1,400 sailors killed. The name, Iron Bottom Sound, wasn't poetic, it was literal. In just a few days, the seabed here had claimed more steel and lives than any other patch of ocean its size. News of the loss reached Tokyo days later, heavily censored for the public but devastating for the naval staff. The idea that 2 capital ships could be destroyed at night, by Americans, was almost unthinkable. Japan's admirals had believed that night battles were their territory, their home field. Now they had been beaten on their own terms. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto himself reportedly remarked, "We have been shown a new way of war, and it is not ours." The battle didn't end the fighting in the Solomons, but it marked a pivot point. With the Japanese surface fleet weakened, American supply lines to Guadalcanal became more secure. Henderson Field, battered but unbroken, would continue to launch strikes that harassed Japanese shipping day after day. By February 1943, the Japanese High Command accepted the inevitable. Guadalcanal was evacuated in Operation Coup, and the island was firmly in American hands. The long, bloody struggle in the Solomons was far from over, but the momentum had shifted. For the men who fought that night, the memory never faded. Survivors of Washington remembered the thunder of the big guns and the eerie feeling of watching radar blips vanish as enemy ships went under. Japanese survivors spoke of the shock, the sudden, invisible barrages that came without warning, the helplessness of not even seeing who was killing you. Historians would later call it the Second Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, but for those who were there, it was something more personal, the night the ocean turned against Japan. And perhaps most hauntingly of all, it was only the beginning. February 9, 1943, the end of Guadalcanal. The last Japanese soldiers slipped away under the cover of darkness, leaving only footprints in the wet sand and empty shell casings scattered in the jungle. Operation Coup, the evacuation of Guadalcanal, was complete. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, Japan had lost an entire strategic campaign. It wasn't just an island they surrendered, it was the initiative in the Pacific. On the decks of U.S. transports, Marines watched the horizon with a mix of relief and exhaustion. They had endured 6 months of hunger, disease, and relentless bombardment. But the naval battles, especially the ones fought in pitch-black darkness, had been the real turning point. After the Second Naval Battle of Guadalcanal in November 1942, the U.S. Navy understood something Japan did not yet fully grasp. The age of nighttime Japanese dominance was over. The SG radar had proven it could spot enemy ships 20,000 plus yards away, even in storms, fog, or complete darkness. In earlier months, the Imperial Japanese Navy had relied on their superb night optics and the devastating Type 93 Long Lance torpedo, which could hit targets up to 40 kilometers away. At Savo Island, those tactics had sunk for Allied cruisers in less than an hour. But radar rewrote the script. Now, American ships could detect and target Japanese vessels before they were even aware they had been spotted. For the Japanese, it was like fighting an invisible enemy. By early 1943, Japan's naval staff began urgent efforts to develop their own radar systems. The first, the Type 21 air search radar, was installed on some destroyers and cruisers. But these sets were bulky, less accurate, and far inferior to the American SG radar. They could detect an incoming bomber squadron, but tracking a fast-moving destroyer at night was still nearly impossible. Instead, Japanese night tactics shifted toward ambush and surprise torpedo spreads. Admiral Reizo Tanaka, commander of the famed Tokyo Express supply runs, adapted by hugging coastlines, cutting engines, and using island shadows to hide. But every month, American radar crews grew sharper, and Japanese losses mounted. July 6, 1943, Kula Gulf, in the Solomon Islands, was another stage for the night war. On this moonless night, Admiral Ainsworth's task Group 36.1, 3 light cruisers, Honolulu, Helena, St. Louis, and 4 destroyers, moved to intercept Japanese destroyers delivering troops to Kalambangara. At 1:57, U.S. radar picked up contacts at 16,000 yards, 4 Japanese destroyers under Captain Izaki Shunji. Within minutes, American cruisers opened fire. The USS Helena, firing at a rate of 20 rounds per gun per minute, was a torrent of light and steel in the darkness. But radar wasn't invincible. The Japanese responded with a massive Type 93 torpedo salvo. At 2:40, Helena was struck by 3 torpedoes. She broke apart and sank within 20 minutes, taking 168 men with her. The battle ended as a tactical draw. Japanese troops landed, but 2 of their destroyers were sunk. It was a grim reminder that even with radar, the long-lance torpedo remained a deadly equalizer. July 13, 1943, just a week later, the U.S. fleet faced another brutal night fight. Ainsworth again engaged a Japanese reinforcement convoy in the Battle of Kalambangara. American radar gave the first warning, and cruiser gunfire was devastating. But once again, Japanese torpedoes found their mark. The light cruiser USS Gwin was sunk, and both Honolulu and St. Louis were crippled. The Japanese lost 1 light cruiser, Jintsu, but achieved their mission. Over 1,200 soldiers reached the island. The pattern was clear. America's radar dominance gave them first strike, but Japan's torpedoes meant every night battle carried deadly risks. By late 1943, Admiral William Halsey adjusted his strategy. Instead of risking cruisers in confined waters, he increasingly relied on radar-equipped destroyers for night sweeps. Fast, maneuverable, and carrying their own torpedoes, these ships could exploit radar without presenting the large target profile of a cruiser. One of the most famous examples was the Battle of Vella Gulf on August 6 to 7, 1943. 6 U.S. destroyers under Commander Frederick Moosbrugger intercepted 4 Japanese destroyers running troops. Using radar, the Americans approached undetected to within 5,000 yards, launched torpedoes first, and sank 3 Japanese ships without taking a single hit. It was a near-perfect execution of radar-led night tactics, and a devastating blow to Japan's Tokyo Express. The cumulative effect of these defeats was psychological as well as strategic. Japanese destroyer crews began to dread radar. Sailors called it the invisible eye. Even before a shot was fired, they feared they were already being watched, already targeted. By early 1944, Japanese naval doctrine shifted toward avoiding night surface battles altogether, except when absolutely necessary. Battleships and cruisers were increasingly held back for decisive engagements that never came. Guadalcanal and the following Solomon Islands battles forced Japan into a defensive stance. The Americans, now masters of radar-directed gunnery, pushed relentlessly up the island chain, New Georgia, Bougainville, the Bismarck Sea. Every step forward tightened the noose on Rabaul, Japan's great forward base. By mid-1944, the Imperial Navy's surface fleet was a shadow of its former self. The night, once its most potent weapon, now belonged to the Americans. The story that began in the black waters off Guadalcanal ended with a sobering truth. Technology had erased centuries of naval tradition. No matter how skilled a lookout, no matter how fast a torpedo, A ship spotted and targeted by radar in total darkness was already halfway to destruction. For the veterans who fought in those night battles, the memories never left. American sailors recalled the strange confidence of knowing the enemy was out there, unseen but not unfound. Japanese sailors remembered the terror of being fired upon by ships they couldn't even see. And so, in the war's long and bloody chronicle, one fact stood out. On the night of November 14th to 15th, 1942, in the waters off Guadalcanal, the ocean stopped belonging to Japan. By the autumn of 1944, the U.S. Navy was a different beast than the one that had fought desperately at Guadalcanal. Now, it was larger, faster, and, above all, electronically omnipresent. Every major warship carried advanced SG or SK radar, and crews had years of experience reading its green-tinted echoes. The night was no longer the great equalizer. It was America's hunting ground. It was 23:47 hours, November 13th, 1942. The waters of the Solomon Islands were pitch black, the moon hidden behind thick, low clouds. The air was heavy, almost suffocating. Out on the dark surface of Iron Bottom Sound, waves slapped quietly against steel hulls, and somewhere far in the distance, the last echoes of daytime gunfire still lingered like a ghost. On the Japanese battleship Hai, the bridge crew studied their maps under dim red light. The ship's captain, Nishida Masao, leaned over the plotting table. His brow was furrowed. American fleet sighted earlier, then vanished. "This is troubling," he muttered. All around him, the men had the same uneasy thought. Where were the Americans? They believed they had control of these waters. For months, Japanese naval forces had dominated the night battles here. Their long-range Type 93 Long Lance torpedoes were unmatched, and their night fighting doctrine was the pride of the Imperial Navy. Every sailor here had been told, at night, Japan was invincible. They were wrong, because somewhere in the black waters, closing the distance with silent precision, were two of America's most dangerous battleships, the USS Washington and USS South Dakota, along with a screen of 4 destroyers. And they weren't alone by accident. This was no desperate patrol. This was Admiral William Bull Halsey's trap. 4 days earlier, November 9th, 1942, American intelligence at Pearl Harbor intercepted Japanese radio traffic. Codebreakers in the basement of Station HYPO confirmed it. Japan was sending a massive reinforcement force to Guadalcanal. Nearly 11,000 troops, dozens of artillery pieces, fuel, ammunition, and, most dangerously, battleships to bombard Henderson Field. If Henderson Field fell, Guadalcanal would be lost, and with it, America's ability to push back in the South Pacific. Within minutes, explosions ripped through Fuso, breaking her in two. Other torpedo hits sank destroyers Yamagumo and Asagamo. The black water was filled with fire and wreckage before the main gun duel had even begun. At 3:51, Oldendorf gave the order, "Open fire." From over 20,000 yards, 6 U.S. battleships, California, Tennessee, West Virginia, Maryland, Mississippi, and Pennsylvania, lit up the night. Every ship used radar fire control, allowing them to target accurately through smoke and darkness. The West Virginia fired the first salvo. Within moments, the Yamashiro was being pummeled from multiple angles, her decks exploding in showers of sparks. Japanese gunners fired back blindly, their shells splashing harmlessly hundreds of yards away. By 4:20, Yamashiro rolled over and sank. The battle was over. The last battleship versus battleship engagement in history had ended in an overwhelming American victory. Only Mogami and 1 destroyer limped away, both heavily damaged. Surigao Strait was more than just a tactical success. It was proof that radar-controlled gunnery had completely eliminated Japan's night advantage. In the entire engagement, the Americans never lost a ship to surface gunfire. Every Japanese loss had been preceded by radar detection and precise coordination. Vice Admiral Nishimura's force had been annihilated before it could even see its main targets clearly. After Surigao, Japan's surface navy was no longer capable of major offensive operations. But this didn't mean the nights grew quiet. Instead, a new kind of threat emerged: kamikaze attacks. While these were mostly daytime missions, American sailors remained on edge even at night, scanning radar for any low-flying intruder. Yet in surface engagements, Radar meant the Japanese could no longer approach undetected. The Americans had turned the night into a killing ground. As the war entered 1945, Japanese surface combat was rare, but not extinct. Small destroyer and escort groups still attempted night raids, often in the waters around the Philippines, Okinawa, and the East China Sea. But these ended much like earlier battles: radar contact, coordinated torpedo and gunfire, and swift destruction. One of the final examples came in April 1945 during the Okinawa campaign. U.S. radar picket destroyers detected incoming Japanese motor torpedo boats at night. Within minutes, American destroyers and PT boats moved to intercept, sinking several before they could approach transport ships. The Japanese had hoped for a surprise attack. Instead, they were spotted and eliminated before they could even fire. For generations, the Imperial Japanese Navy had prided itself on night combat mastery. Their lookouts could spot enemy silhouettes in starlight. Their gunners could adjust by flash and sound alone. But by 1945, none of that mattered. A radar operator in a sealed, dimly lit control room could see farther than the sharpest human eye and could do it in any weather, at any hour. The Pacific War at night had gone from a contest of nerves and eyesight to a clinical process. Detect on radar, track range, and speed automatically. Fire with precision unseen in naval history. Japan couldn't believe how completely the Americans had stolen the night from them, and by the time they fully understood, it was too late to adapt. When the guns finally fell silent in August 1945, the survivors of these night battles carried memories that would never fade. American sailors recalled the eerie glow of radar screens, the calm voice of fire control officers giving range and bearing, and the sudden flashes of their own guns tearing apart ships they had never even seen with the naked eye. Japanese sailors remembered something different: the fear of an enemy they could not see, the roar of shells from unseen positions, and the slow realization that their proud tradition of night fighting was now a relic. The Pacific had taught a brutal lesson. In modern war, technology could erase centuries of skill in a single campaign. And so, from Guadalcanal's black waters to Surigao Strait's burning horizon, one truth remained. In the Pacific at night, Japan once ruled, but by war's end, the darkness belonged to America. It was the summer of 1945. The Pacific was on fire. The war had raged for nearly 4 years, and Japan's empire was collapsing. But even in its final days, Tokyo's naval command clung to one desperate hope: that the darkness of night could still protect their ships from America's overwhelming power. On the evening of July 27, 1945, under a moonless, cloud-choked sky, the Imperial Japanese Navy dispatched a small but vital convoy from the port of Kure. Their mission was critical: deliver over 1,200 soldiers, many of them wounded from previous battles, along with precious crates of Type 92 heavy machine gun ammunition and naval shells, to defensive positions on the southern tip of Kyushu. The convoy consisted of 2 transports, Taira Maru No. 3 and Koto Maru, escorted by 3 veteran destroyers, Hatsushimo, Yukikase, and Asashimo. Every man aboard those ships believed the darkness would be their shield. But they didn't know the Americans had already read their plans. From thousands of miles away, codebreakers at Pearl Harbor Station HYPO intercepted Japanese radio traffic, decrypting orders that revealed not only the convoy's route, but the exact departure time. That intelligence was handed directly to Task Force 38, operating out of the Philippines under Admiral William Halsey. Within hours, a powerful night hunting group was dispatched to the East China Sea to intercept. The hunter-killer group was led by the USS Wichita, CA-45, a 10,000-ton heavy cruiser armed with 9 8-inch guns. Alongside her were the light cruisers USS Vincennes, CL-64, and USS Miami, CL-89, each bristling with rapid-fire 6-inch turrets. Screening them were 4 destroyers, including the famed USS Charles Osborne, DD-570, Captain Ernest E. Evans's old flagship in the Solomons, now under the command of Commander E.C. Ewan. In total, the American force carried more than 3,200 sailors, all trained for one purpose: dominate the night. At 22:13 hours, Wichita's SG radar picked up faint contacts: 5 ships, moving at 12 knots, bearing 0-15 degrees. They were exactly where the intercepted orders had said they would be. The Americans kept silent, throttling forward but holding their fire, closing the distance in ghostly silence. By 2246, the range had dropped to just under 10,000 yards. In the pitch-black night, the Japanese saw nothing. No silhouettes, no searchlights, only the sound of the wind over the water. At 2251, Captain Charles Wellborn aboard the Wichita gave the order. Open fire. The stillness of the night shattered. Wichita's forward turrets unleashed a blinding salvo, each 260-pound shell screaming through the dark before smashing into Hatsushima. The destroyer's bridge erupted in flames, its command crew wiped out instantly. USS Vincennes pivoted her guns toward Yukake's, her 6-inch salvos walking up the length of the ship, blowing apart her forward gun mounts. USS Miami targeted Terra Maru No. 3, sending shells plunging through her decks and igniting ammunition stores. Then came the destroyers. USS Charles Osborne, USS Dyson, and USS Claxton fanned out to launch torpedo spreads. At 22:55, 10 Mark 15 torpedoes streaked unseen through the black water. 2 slammed into Koto Maru, tearing her hull open. A third struck Yukake's, flooding her aft section and crippling her steering. The Japanese fought back blindly, firing at the muzzle flashes. A lucky 127mm shell from Asashimo struck Wichita's superstructure, killing 2 sailors and wounding 6, but the damage was superficial. By 23:12, the battle was over. Hatsushima sank stern first into the East China Sea. Koto Maru and Terra Maru No. 3 were gone, their survivors scattered among burning debris. Yukake's limped away trailing smoke, her speed reduced to a crawl, while Asashimo escaped only because the Americans did not pursue into known submarine waters. In just 21 minutes, the Americans had destroyed nearly 8,000 tons of shipping, killed or captured over 900 Japanese personnel, and ensured that those supplies would never reach Kyushu. The Japanese survivors would later speak in hushed tones about that night. They never saw the Americans coming. There were no warning flares, no searchlights, no chance to maneuver. Only the sudden roar of guns and the fire of exploding ships. To them, it was as if the darkness itself had betrayed them. When the news reached Tokyo on the morning of July 28th, senior naval officers were stunned. If even the night could no longer shield them, then nothing could. The Imperial Navy, once feared across the Pacific, was reduced to scattered remnants. Too few ships to fight, too little fuel to move them, and no safe harbor left to hide in. And still, the Americans kept coming. In the days before the atomic bombings, U.S. cruisers and destroyers prowled Japan's coastal waters, destroying anything that dared to move after sunset. By the time Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945, the sea, day or night, belonged entirely to the United States. Some Japanese officers would later admit, quietly, that it wasn't only the atomic bombs that ended the war. It was this realization. Even in the dark, America could find us. If you want more untold stories from the Pacific War, battles fought in the shadows, strategies that changed history, and the human moments behind the gunfire, then make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications. History isn't just dates and names. It's the stories we keep alive. Don't miss the next one.